It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, if you listened to last week's episode in which I talked about the Monster Club, then you might have remembered me bringing up Amicus Productions. Now, to follow up on that mention, let's look at an actual Amicus Anthology, The House That Dripped Blood. The House That Dripped Blood was one of the popular portmanteau films that Amicus made. These included such films as Asylum, Tales from the Crypt, and The Vault of Horror. And if I had to guess, the founders of Amicus Productions, producers and screenwriters Milton Subotsky and Max Rosenberg, they were likely attracted to these types of movies because of two reasons. One, they could get a large cast of recognizable actors, particularly from British films or from British stage work. And two, you get a little bit more of that bang for your buck kind of appeal. Instead of having to focus all of your efforts on one story that has lots of potentials and spots in the plot where things could end up falling apart for the story as a whole, well, why not have 3 or 4 or 5 really concentrated stories that has set up, a hook, and a payoff, or a twist that could be horrifying or funny or both or whatever. It becomes more like watching new episodes of Twilight Zone long after the series had ended. And it also doesn't force anyone to have to pay too much attention for too long. It's kind of amazing there aren't more shows or movies that do that today. Amicus would often bring in lots of British talent to appear in films. This is likely due to the success of Hammer Films, which Amicus is often described as a rival to, though I definitely disagree on that concept. I've come to think of them as two companies that competed against one another, but brought different things to the table. Think of them as like the Marvel and DC of horror films of that era. If you get, they give you kind of similar things, but with different flavors. Amicus and Hammer shared a lot of talent, from directors like Roy Ward Baker to actors like Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Both of those actors appear in this movie. Robert Bloch, author of Psycho, and a guy who's often tinkered with the idea of Jack the Ripper as an ethereal, immortal, kind of astral or spiritual threat, as opposed to being just one guy who did awful things, is credited as the writer of this movie. He'd go on to also write Asylum for Amicus a year later. However, a second person is credited on Wikipedia and IMDb as a writer, but is actually not credited officially on the film. Russ Jones. Jones writes the segment in this movie called Waxworks. Now, if Subotsky and Rosenberg deciding to adapt 2 EC comic horror anthologies, Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror, isn't enough of a sign that they were comic book reading monster kids growing up, their usage of Russ Jones as a writer for one of these stories might also confirm that they still read the stuff. Jones's career was really in comics. He worked for Marvel, Charlton, DC, and for the horror magazines Creepy, Eerie, and did some cover work for Famous Monsters of Filmland. He was quite successful out of the gate with a lot of that work on those horror mags coming while he was still in his early 20s. Later on, he took the pseudonym Jack Younger to become a paperback novelist. But what is The House That Dripped Blood? Well, it's the house that this whole movie and each story takes place in. At the beginning of the movie, we meet Inspector Holloway from Scotland Yard. The inspector is investigating the house because the film star Paul Henderson has gone missing shortly after renting this large spooky mansion. Turns out Henderson was not the first person that something peculiar happened to in this house. So the local cop helping the inspector tells Holloway about the strange goings-on at the house. And the first story centers around a couple, the Hilliers, who come to the house to rent the place from an estate that owned the land and owned the house. The Hilliers are Charles and Alice, and Charles is a writer, and more accurately, he's a hack writer of various lowbrow thrillers and horror books. Now, Charles is played by Denholm Elliott of Indiana Jones fame. Alice, played by Joanna Dunham, is very unimpressed with the house at first. She's disappointed that Charles ends up loving the place, particularly the dusty collection of old books in the library that have kind of macabre themes to them. Now, Charles's writer's block is lifted almost immediately as he begins to write a story about a strangler named Dominic. Charles is actually quite obsessed with Dominic, going so far as to say he can see him so clearly in his mind's eye that he can almost know exactly how the strangler thinks. Not just that, but one night while taking a smoke break, Charles begins to see Dominic in a mirror and hears his laughter that the strangler lets out in his story whenever he's on the prowl for a victim. Unnerved by what he experienced that night, Charles begins to struggle completing his book about Dominic without being haunted by the creation of his imagination. And worried about her husband's mental health, she convinces Charles to see a psychiatrist who basically tells him that a writer creating a character is kind of like an actor inhabiting a role. Sometimes it just kind of takes over. And sure enough, Charles, who at first thought he's seeing Dominic trying to strangle Alice in the reflection one night when she's in the kitchen, rushes to go help his wife only to be basically rebuffed by her saying that it was actually he who was trying to strangle her, not this made-up character. So Dr. Andrews tells Charles that what's going on with his psyche, which is basically he's got kind of deep down hostility for his wife. And the way that he's bringing this out, like all writers do, is by creating a character to kind of play off of that as kind of a release. And as he's saying this, Dominic sneaks up behind Dr. Andrews and strangles him. Dominic then returns to the house to find Alice alone, and he begins to stalk her. But there's a twist. Dominic technically is real. Alice has been cheating on Charles with an actor named Richard, who is playing the character Dominic. And she plans to basically get Charles put away for being insane so that she and Richard can run away together and live off of Charles's royalty checks. But Richard killed both Dr. Andrews and Charles. Basically obsessed with the role he's playing, Richard begins to strangle and kill Alice as well. The local policeman tells Inspector Holloway that they found Richard over Alice's dead body laughing, and it was the house that got to Richard and made him kill. We then move into the second story about Philip Grayson, played by Peter Cushing. Now, Grayson is a retired stockbroker, and he's taken over the house and basically plans to spend his retirement there to indulge in his favorite hobbies of listening to records, going through old programs of his favorite plays and operas that he went and saw. However, he quickly becomes lonely and haunted by the picture of a beautiful woman he was once in love with. One day he's walking about town and spots a wax museum that he decides to take in. Inside the museum, Grayson finds all sorts of ghastly things, but he also finds something rather beautiful. He finds a wax sculpture of a woman that was named Salome. Now, she's holding a tray with a decapitated head on it. Now, the guy who runs the museum says people see all sorts of others that they knew or know currently within her face. And to Grayson, she looks like the woman he loved. The proprietor says it was molded after his wife, who he found with an axe in her hand after she had murdered his best friend. But as beautiful as she is, even after the tale he tells everyone who discovers her, men keep coming back to gaze upon her. Grayson says he's not coming back, but he's inexplicably drawn to it and dreams of the sculpture pretty much all the time now. One night, Grayson's friend Neville arrives unexpectedly while Neville was passing through town on a business trip. And it turns out both he and Grayson were in love with that same woman, but when she died, they reconciled and continued their friendship. The next day, in town, Neville decides he too wants to go into the wax museum and discovers Salome and notes how beautiful she is. Neville leaves to continue on with his business trip, and Grayson returns to the wax museum where he finds Neville staring at the figurine again. Later, Neville returns to Grayson's place to apologize. Grayson says there is something evil about that wax statue, and Neville agrees. And the following day, Neville calls Grayson to tell him that he's not left town and is staying at the local motel. And he tells Grayson that he just has to return to the wax museum, but Grayson begs him not to go back. And so Grayson goes to the hotel, doesn't find Neville there. And so when Grayson arrives at the wax museum, he sees Neville's head on the platter that Salome is carrying. The proprietor of the museum then tells Grayson that he was actually the one who killed his wife. He said that she always had this power to draw men to her. He killed his best friend and framed her. And once she hanged for doing what she did, or what the police claim she did, he got her body, which allowed for him to make her figure out of wax. He then attacks Grayson. Later, another man comes into the wax museum and finds Salome with Grayson's head on the platter now. Now, Holloway is wanting to get to the bottom of this faster than he's been able to. And he asked the cop if Henderson was the next to come to the house, but there was actually someone else who moved in after Philip Grayson. So Holloway goes to the leasing agent, one A.J. Stoker, to ask questions. Now, Stoker claims he warned each and every one of the people, or tried to warn each and every one of the people who moved in about the house's secret. He even asks Holloway if he has guessed the secret yet, and Holloway thinks this is all crazy, so he just wants to know more about the person who lived there before Henderson. Now we find out about widower John Reed, played by Christopher Lee, and his young daughter Jane. Now Jane, when we first meet her, is pyrophobic, meaning she's scared of fire. And John is interviewing a teacher named Ann Norton, played by Nyree Dawn Porter. Ann is also a widow, but she's very good with Jane, and the two bond very quickly. Anne discovers that John does not want Jane to play with other children, nor does he want her to own any toys. But Jane is much less scared of fire as she and Anne become closer. And John forbids Anne to take Jane to the nearby playground. He says that he has reasons, but he will not reveal them at this time. Now, he does apparently allow Anne to buy Jane toys, but he becomes enraged when he finds out that Anne bought Jane a baby doll. And he wanted her to buy Anne educational toys, not playful toys, and certainly not a doll. So he throws the doll into the fireplace and destroys it. He then tells Anne that he was glad when his wife died after he found out what she really was. And one day, Anne sees that Jane is reading a book on witchcraft that was hidden in her room. And Anne wants basically answers from John. She thinks John is afraid of Jane, which he absolutely is. And why else would he have thrown the doll into the fire instead of just throwing it away in the garbage? But during a storm, the power goes out, and John discovers that Jane has taken and used some of the candles, but won't reveal how or where she took them. And when he doesn't get the answers he's demanding from her, he ends up slapping Jane. And the next day, Jane gets trimmings from John's electric shaver, and she puts them onto a wax voodoo doll that she uses to hurt John and eventually leave him bedridden. John eventually tells Anne that Jane's mother was indeed a witch. Anne begins to realize how Jane is hurting her father and begs Jane to give her the wax voodoo doll. But Jane throws the doll into the fire, and John burns to death as Jane's face reveals an evil smile. Stoker finishes that story and decides to go into the final story so that Holloway can finally hear what became of Paul Henderson. Now, Paul Henderson, played by John Pertwee, arrives at the house to speak to Stoker about renting the place while he's working on a movie. He's there with his girlfriend Carla, played by Ingrid Pitt. Henderson is kind of uppity and says he's not just a star of horror films. Oh no, he's an expert and even ponders Stoker's name, kind of giving him that when he hears the guy's name. But Paul is unhappy with the set on the movie. He's unhappy with the young, inexperienced director. He demands realism. He bemoans how nothing feels authentic in present day horror films. He even bemoans this quote unquote new fellow who is playing Dracula these days, as he prefers Lugosi, which is great because Christopher Lee's we just saw him in the previous story. So that's great that, throwing a little shade even at Christopher Lee just for fun. But when he's presented with his cape from the wardrobe lady, he says he wants something more authentic, something more lived in. And he finds a card left for him in his dressing room for Theo von Hartmann's antique shop. And when he gets to this guy's shop, he discovers all sorts of nasty goodies inside. And what he takes most interest in is a very special cloak. When he puts on the cloak, Henderson even feels a little chill run down his spine, and von Hartmann sells the cloak to Henderson for a mere 13 shillings. Back in his dressing room before he goes out to film a scene, he puts the cloak on and is shocked to see that he can no longer see himself in the mirror. And while shooting a scene in which he is supposed to embrace and then bite Carla, he's overcome with the desire to actually bite her. And later that night, he puts on the cloak again, and sure enough, he's not able to see his reflection in the mirror. And when the clock strikes midnight, the witching hour, he grows fangs and starts levitating. The next night, as he dines with Carla, he reads an article about the antique shop that he bought the cloak from burning in a fire. And the body of von Hartmann was found, and he had been dead for years. So now Henderson believes that perhaps von Hartmann was a vampire, and passing the cloak on to him basically allows von Hartmann to die and then turns Henderson into a vampire. When Carla tells him to put the cloak on to prove that nothing is wrong with it and out of the ordinary, he does, and nothing happens. But it turns out this was a trick. Carla has tricked Henderson by switching the cloaks with the one from the studio. And when she puts on the cloak from von Hartmann and she grows fangs and tells Henderson that they liked his film so much, they decided to make him one of them. And she turns into a vampire, flies up to get to him on the second floor so that she can bite him. Now, Holloway has had enough of these spooky stories. He demands Stoker give him the keys to the place to look around. Stoker tries to convince him to wait until morning, but Holloway refuses. Holloway drives out to the house and enters and explores the various rooms, and he finds a locked room in the basement that he forces his way into and discovers Henderson, who is now a full-blown vampire. Henderson attacks, but Holloway, defending himself, is able to kill Henderson with a broken piece of wood. But then Carla awakens, transforms into a bat, and flies towards Holloway to kill him. The next morning, Stoker tells the audience, in a bit of fourth wall breaking, that the secret of the house is how it finds the true nature of those who occupy it and treats them accordingly. But the audience shouldn't worry too much because there's nothing to fear provided you're the right sort of person. So let's talk about the things I like about The House That Dripped Blood. The first of three likes, I really like the story about the wax museum. That story was called Waxworks. And what I really like about it is the two, is kind of twofold. First, you have Peter Cushing, who is not often seen as a more dramatic, kind of sympathetic role. Sure, we love him as the heroic Van Helsing or the evil Dr. Frankenstein, but we rarely see him as this kind of normal, everyday, but lonely old man. Then, when Joss Ackland comes in as his friend Neville, that's a great friendship. And that's the other kind of thing about this story that I really like. There's a really great friendship there, and there's something very nice about an older guy finding friendship with another adult man who, he is very excited and happy to see when that friend just passes through town. It relieves relieves the Peter Cushing character loneliness so nicely. It's just a nice friendship. The two also having a rivalry for a woman who has since died is also a positive reminder of what the right thing to do is. Overcome the sadness and resume the friendship. It's a lovely thing. And of course, the undoing is the wax statue of Salome. But I like the two of them and could have done for a whole film starring both of them instead of just that quick 20 or so minute story featuring them. But yeah, it's just a really nice relationship. And they're two veteran actors who are just getting along really, really well. Next, in the story Sweets to the Sweet, about the young girl and her widowed father, I really like the performance from Chloe Franks as little Jane Reed. She's kind of playing it like she's been developmentally stunted, but she's also very intelligent. When we first meet Joan, and Anne is trying to talk to her and introduce herself to the little girl, Chloe Franks is playing her almost as if she's trapped inside her own mind. She moves her head and looks away, but really not at anything at all. It's like she's just not even there in the same room with Anne. There's a look about her that almost comes across as if she's always calculating. She's always curious about things, which makes sense if she's been sheltered so much by her father. It would make sense that she is calculating, or at least always curious about stuff. But later, when she reveals to have become quite practiced as a witch, she's downright menacing. I mean, it's a really interesting performance from a very young actor. So kudos to Chloe Franks. And thirdly, come on, man. I mean, I got to give a like to Jon Pertwee. Pertwee has been and always shall be my favorite Doctor on Doctor Who. You can't help but to see a little of that in his role as Henderson. He had already taken on the part of the Doctor by the time he was in this film, so he gets to be a little bit more exaggerated than he was as the Doctor. First, he gets to be a kind of stuck-up, self-important star of horror films, even though he's making one called Curse of the Bloodsuckers, and the scene that we get to see he and Ingrid Pitt filming is pretty silly. But when he turns into a vampire, he gets to use that incredibly rubbery, flexible face of his. It's not like I get to see many movies with Jon Pertwee, so it's always a joy to see him, not just in a movie, but to not just be able to play a combination of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, but that he is actually, his character is the entire thrust of this movie. The whole reason why these stories are being told is because Paul Henderson has gone missing. And it's just fantastic. I love Jon Pertwee. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Wednesday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, I'm going to give myself a Christmas and holiday gift. I want to talk about the fun Godzilla movie that came out just a few months after that heavy, serious one. Yep, gather around and get your Kong-loving friends in here too, because it's time for Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. So until next week, stay spooky.